The next part is we're going to cut our watercolor paper because we're going to do some watercoloring on the inside. I am using Canson watercolor. This is a 9x12 block and it's 140 pound, and this is cold press. You don't have to use cold press. You can use hot press. You don't have to use watercolor paper, but I highly recommend watercolor paper because it just does a better job, in my opinion, when you lay down your color. So you know how to cut into 5x7 squares. I'm not going to show you that on video. We're going to cut a 5x7 square, and then we're going to need some, if you want your mountains to be colored, then you're going to need some additional either strips of watercolor if you want to watercolor your mountain, or white cardstock, or whatever color cardstock you want. I wanted this to be kind of a dark scene, so I did black mountains. So maybe for this one I'll do two different ones. I'll do a dark scene like this, and then I'll do a different color scene since I'm doing two cards. Let the cutting begin. I have my two 5x7 pieces of paper. I did two because I'm doing two cards at the same time. Now something, I just cut these from the watercolor paper. Something you might want to do is cut it slightly smaller than 7 inches wide, because it'll fit in your shadow box card better. So that's what I'm doing with both of these. Now that we've got our roughly 5x7 sheet cut, we need to think about how we're going to lay this out. So what I did was I painted the foreground and the background on the same piece of paper, but I cut the paper. So if you want a little bit of foreground and a lot of background, then you're gonna not cut this in half. But I'm gonna cut both sheets in half because remember, I'm doing two cards at the same time. So let's see, they're 5 inches wide. So I'm going to cut them both to 2.5 inches wide. And why am I doing 2 and you're doing 1? Because I'm doing two cards at the same time. Nothing says you can't do two cards at the same time. Now for the fun part. Okay, this whole thing is fun. But now we're going to do some watercolor. So I've got my watercolor palette. These are dandelion paints that I get in a monthly subscription kit from Let's Make Art. You don't have to do this with watercolor. You could do this with colored pencil. You could do this with marking pen. You could also use stamp pads. But I've got watercolor paint, and this is liquid. I love it because the color is so vibrant. You don't have to use liquid watercolor either. You could use tubes. You could use pans. You could use cakes, whatever. Sky's the limit. You could probably do acrylic too. This is just what I have on hand. I also do some watercolor instructional videos. So I'm going to go over the colors that I'm using. I'm using space blue, azure blue, amethyst, fuchsia, pine green, and yellow. And you don't have to use these exact colors. So basically I have a darker blue, a really vibrant blue, kind of a cyan, a purple, a bright pink, a green, and a yellow. And to lay down this color, I'm going to use a sponge brush. You don't have to use a sponge brush. You could use a fat watercolor brush if you wanted to. It's up to you how you want to do it. This is just what I'm going to do. I have an acrylic clipboard that I like to use when I'm doing smaller watercolor paintings. And I've taped down just the corners of my paper. When I do a watercolor painting, I usually tape down all of the sides, but that's going to leave us with a little bit of a border. And I don't want that border, so I just did corners. You just want it to be a really small corner. I'm using blue masking tape. Sometimes this does take up a little bit of paper when we peel it up, but we can use a heat tool to heat it up and we won't have that problem. That's why I went and I got basically this block. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the water. And for the water, I put a little bit of green over in the corner. And then I did two different blues. Space blue is slightly more purpley. Azure blue is just really brilliant and beautiful. We want the color to be really vibrant. Remember, I'm doing 2 cards at the same time. So that's why I'm doing 2. Obviously, if you want to do 2 cards at the same time, you are more than welcome to. And I might end up having to put down more paint in my wells of my palette. I want to have my towel handy. I'm gonna get my brush wet. I'm gonna start with this green. I don't want my brush sopping wet, but I don't want it dry. And I'm gonna dab this green down. Oh, this is gonna be backward to you. Okay, I need to, or upside down. I need to think upside down. So I'm gonna just dab this green down. That's gonna be the little corner that the hunter is in, or that I might later put a tree or a tent. I haven't quite decided what I'm gonna do with the one that I do only Stampin' Up stuff on. So we're gonna let this dry. If you have a heat tool, go ahead and use your heat tool. That'll make it go faster. If you don't have a heat tool, well, then just wait. I used a heat tool to speed the drying process. You don't have to use the heat tool. You could take a break and go make a sandwich and wait for it to dry. Okay. You want to make sure that it's dry. Otherwise, you're going to get your color to bleed into your blue, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, we're going to do some overlap anyway, but you know, if it's not dry enough, then you're going to ruin your beautiful, brilliant color. Now, you'll see on mine, maybe I have some darker areas, and these are blooms. Some watercolor artists like blooms, some don't like blooms. For me, it really depends on what I'm doing, and even when I'm doing a photorealistic, I find I'm not necessarily opposed to the blooms. It's kind of a cool effect. Here, this isn't about watercolor. This is about this card, and we just need some color. So don't worry if you got blooms. Now what we're going to do is we are going to take, for me it's the space blue, and that's kind of the purpley blue. We're going to start up here. So at the top, it's going to be darker because this is further in the distance. And then as it gets closer, it's going to be lighter. Brush is wet, and I'm going to lay down some color. And remember, I'm doing 2. You can brush, you can dab, doesn't necessarily matter. Get the color down. And if you end up with some white spots, that's okay. When I'm doing watercolor, sometimes I like those white spots. Yeah, white paper is really powerful in watercolor. And I realize we're not watercoloring right now per se, we're stamping, but you know, we are using watercolor. I'm going over the green, as you can see, and I actually dipped my sponge brush into the water. I'm not getting it super wet, but I just got it wetter so that I could get some lighter values. And you'll notice my blue or my green bled down here. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So I'm going to get some more of that space blue, and I'm going to dab it in. And if it's too wet, we're going to end up with a mess. So you might want to wait. And look, it's curling, which is something watercolor paper does. Welcome to the frustration of watercolor. You might decide that you need to add more green. Blah, blah, blah. This doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to wait for this to dry. And it's come up from its corners. So if you're using a heat tool, you can get it to stop curling with your heat tool. If you're not using a heat tool, you might just have to wait for it to dry and then take it and iron it. With the heat tool, you can alternate drying from the top and the bottom of the page, you know, from the colored side, the right side, and the wrong side, and that'll help take the curl out. So let the drying begin. I took the tape off the corners of my strips because I found it to be utterly useless. So this isn't as vibrant as it is here in the card. That's okay. That's not necessarily going to be exactly the same. I am dipping my brush into the water, getting it a little bit drier. I don't want it to be sopping wet. Now I'm getting that beautiful cyan. And I'm gonna blot that in the background. I want it to be darker in the background. I'm also going to drop it in the water, closer to the foreground. Okay, and we can let that dry a little bit, and then we can take some water, get our brush wet, and we can spread some of that around so that we'll have lighter values and our color won't all be clumped in one area. Okay, and because this isn't completely dry, the paint still spreads pretty well. We're getting some beautiful blooms. We've got some white areas in there still. I think this is going to be great. This is the time that if you want to make any areas like in the back darker, go ahead and make them darker. And if you want to make that little grassy patch darker, make it darker. I just dipped my brush in the water. I'm going to dab around here. I'm going to get it a little bit wetter, pick up a little bit of paint. I don't want quite as much, but I do want the whole thing to be vibrant. So getting some beautiful blooms again. If we wanted, when our painting is still wet, we could take some rock salt. Actually, it doesn't have to be rock salt. It can just be table salt, but I really like rock salt. We could drop it in this water and it would give us some beautiful effects. I'm not going to do that on this one, but feel free to do it. And we're going to take another break and let everything dry. The front and back of our little water strips are now dry and our painting work surface is a mess. I like to keep a bunch of these clipboards on hand because it makes it really convenient to just set one aside and grab a clean one. But I've got all my clipboards taped up with watercolor projects. I even had to take the project off this one. What we're going to do is we're going to get clean water because our water is kind of gross and we don't want this water to spoil what we're going to do for that sunrise or sunset. And we're going to clean our work surface, or if you have another work surface that's clean, go grab it. Our water and grass is now dry. We got clean water. Oh, I should have cleaned my brush. I didn't. Go clean your brush if you didn't. So now what we're going to do is we are going to start at the bottom with yellow, and we may or may not end up seeing the yellow in our card. It really just depends on how we end up placing our mountains. So in my palette, I'm putting the yellow, the fuchsia, which is a pink color, the amethyst, which is a purple color. We want our brush to be wet, but not too wet. We're going to dip it into the yellow. And we're going to dab on yellow. Okay. And you don't have to keep it right down at the bottom. It can come up a little. The yellow and the fuchsia are going to end up mixing, and it's going to kind of end up making an orangish color. I think it's really pretty. And we may or may not see it again. It really just depends on how we end up placing our mountains and our trees. But it's nice to have it there. And it's also cool because as you look at the card from different angles, you can see the color even if you can't see it when you open the card. Now's the time that we let this dry. Let the drying begin. These strips are more or less dry. We want them to be more dry than less. Otherwise, we may lose that beautiful yellow. Going to rinse our brush. We're going to wring it out so that it's not completely dry, but it's drier. We're going to pick up that magenta, which is that beautiful pink color. We're going to dab that in, and it is totally okay if it goes into the yellow because it'll make a beautiful orange. We're going to do that on, well, I'm doing 2 at once. If you're doing 2 at once, then go ahead and do it on both of your strips. And I'm not really gonna rub this around because I don't want to lose that beautiful vibrant color that I've got. We're gonna let the magenta dry. We're gonna rinse off our brush. We're gonna wring it out. Again, we don't want the brush to be dry, but we don't want it to be sopping wet. Otherwise, our colors are not going to be quite as vibrant and they're going to run a little bit more. So let this dry, whether you're taking a break to let it dry or you're using a heat tool, let it dry. For this, we're going to put a little bit of water on our brush. We're going to wring it out a little, and I'm going to let the orange and the yellow, or sorry, the fuchsia and the yellow kind of bleed together. If you don't like how this turns out on mine, then don't do it. If you'd like there to be less of a harsh line between the fuchsia and the yellow, then don't let it dry completely before you do this. Now I'm going to let that dry. If mixing around the water and the yellow between the fuchsia made it so that you lost some of the vibrance in your piece, then you can go back in with a damp brush and straight yellow and just dab in some more color. If you're happy with the way it turned out, don't worry, you can just leave it. But I want mine to be a little bit more vibrant, so I'm going to dab in some more yellow. Of course, this means more drying time. And while we're waiting for it to dry, we can rinse out our brush and get ready, because the next color we put on is going to be amethyst, which is that purplish color. Now that this is pretty much dry, we're going to go in with a damp brush and that amethyst, which is that purple color. And we want it to be darkest up at the top, you know, because the sun is either rising or setting, but the sun is close to the horizon, and so it's going to be darker up top. And it's totally okay if that purple bleeds into the pink. If you want it to bleed more than mine is, then don't let your work dry as much between coats. And I'm going to get my brush wet, and I'm going to kind of try to soften where the purple and the pink mix. It's okay if it doesn't. Again, I want it to be real dark up here. Once you have it the way you want it, then it's time to let it dry. And don't worry if it looks kind of choppy or blocky. You could add clouds to kind of break that up if you wanted. But, you know, we don't want to overwork this. It's a background. So we'll let this dry. This is a good time to go wash out our brush, clean our water, and clean this work surface. And if you didn't use a separate work surface from the one that you're stamping on, well, by all means, clean your work surface, get it to dry.